The woman arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong for the kind of news she was carrying. Nolan Berard was on the back porch when he heard the car pull up. Not a sound he usually paid attention to, because on Rue des Arabes in Sudbury, cars came and went all morning. But this one stopped in a way that felt deliberate. Like whoever was driving had been parked at the end of the block for a while, working up to it. He didn't go inside, he waited. His daughter, Cleo, was at school. She'd be back by 4. He had until 4 to be whatever version of himself he needed to be before she walked through the door and read his face the way she always did. The way her mother used to. He heard the knock, front door. He went around the side of the house. She was standing on the front step with her hands folded in front of her. Not the way people fold their hands when they're nervous, but the way they do when they've decided something, and they're holding themselves steady with it. She was wearing a gray coat, the kind that cost more than a month of Nolan's paychecks used to, back when he still had paychecks. Dark hair pulled back. Maybe 40, maybe a few years older. There was something in her face that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. "Mr. Berard," she said. He didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he doesn't recognize but probably should. "Nolan's fine," he said finally. "Nolan." She said his name like she was confirming something to herself. "My name is Sylvain Cote Whitfield. I ran the Northern Development Division at Harwick Group until 8 months ago." She paused. "I think you know that name." He knew that name. He'd known that name for 4 years. The thing about Harwick Group is that it didn't look like the kind of company that ruined people. It looked like every other resource extraction company operating out of a glass tower in downtown Toronto. Annual reports with photographs of lakes, language about community partnership, a full page dedicated to Indigenous consultation that meant almost nothing in practice. Nolan had worked for one of their subcontractors, a mid-sized drilling operation called Terravance, which ran 3 sites in northern Ontario. He'd been a site foreman for 6 years. He was good at it. His crew was safe. His numbers were solid. Then there was the Abitibi water incident. He didn't cause it. That was the thing. Everyone who looked at it honestly, every inspector, every geologist, everyone except the people who needed someone to blame quickly and cleanly, knew that the ground-level decision that led to the contamination came from Terravance's head office, not from the site. The order to skip the secondary liner on the eastern retention pond. That order had been in writing. Nolan had pushed back on it. He'd sent an email. He had records. None of it mattered. What mattered was that someone needed to be the name in the headline. Someone needed to be the foreman who signed off on unsafe practices, and Nolan's name was on the site log, and it was faster to blame him than to trace the decision back through a chain of management that implicated people with lawyers and share options and the kind of institutional protection that Nolan Berard, at 38 years old, raising a 12-year-old daughter on his own in a rented house on Rue des Arabes, simply did not have. He lost the job in March. By June, he'd lost the industry. No one in Northern Drilling would touch him. His contractor's certification was under review. The union didn't fight hard enough, or maybe didn't fight at all. He still wasn't sure. His lawyer was a family friend who did real estate closings and tried his best. By the time the review board issued its findings that were inconclusive, which is not the same as innocent but is also not the same as guilty, and nobody seemed to understand that difference. Nolan had already spent 14 months not working in the field he'd spent his entire adult life building. He'd taken a job maintaining equipment at a municipal works yard. He drove a 12-year-old truck that needed new brake pads he hadn't gotten around to replacing. He made Cleo's lunches the night before, and he helped her with geometry, and he didn't talk about any of it, because she was 16 by then and she already worried too much. That was the shape of his life when Sylvain Cote Whitfield showed up at his front door on a Tuesday in October. He didn't invite her in right away. He stood in the doorway, not blocking it exactly, but not opening it either, and he said, "What do you want?" "To talk," she said. About what happened on the Abitibi site, about the liner order, about what Harwick knew and when they knew it and what they chose to do about it." She looked at him steadily. "About what was done to you." Something moved in his chest. He recognized it as the thing he'd been careful not to feel for a long time because it had nowhere to go. "You're 4 years late," he said. "I know. Why now?" She didn't look away. "Because 8 months ago I stopped working for the company that made sure this stayed quiet, and because I had access to documents that I didn't fully understand the significance of until I wasn't inside the building anymore. And because I looked you up." She exhaled, a short, careful breath. And because what happened to you wasn't right, and I was part of the structure that allowed it, and I have been trying to figure out what to do with that ever since I left." Nolan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. She sat at his kitchen table like someone who was used to conference rooms and was doing her best not to show it. He made coffee because it gave him something to do with his hands. He set a mug in front of her and sat across from her and waited. She opened a bag he hadn't noticed she was carrying, leather, worn at one corner, and placed a folder on the table between them. "These are internal communications from the spring and summer before the incident," she said. "Specifically, exchanges between Terravance Site Management and the Harwick Northern Division Project Office, including the order regarding the Eastern Retention Pond Liner." She touched the edge of the folder but didn't push it toward him. "There's also a series of emails from the months after, discussing liability strategy, how the narrative was going to be managed." He didn't touch the folder. "Where did you get these?" he said. "I had access to the project files as division head. I kept copies when I left, which I suspect was not entirely legal, so I've had a conversation with a lawyer about that." A pause. "My lawyer, not theirs." "You left the company." "I did, after 4 years." "After 4 years." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to be honest with you about that. I didn't leave because of you, specifically. There were a number of things, accumulated. But when I started going through files in my last weeks there, I don't know why I started looking. I think I already knew something was wrong. I found the Abitibi file. And then I found out what had happened to you afterward." She stopped. "I'd like to say I was shocked. I think I was more. I recognized it. Which was worse in some ways." Nolan looked at the folder. 4 years of a particular kind of exhaustion lived in his body. The kind that comes not from overwork, but from having had something taken from you and not being allowed to say clearly what it was or who took it. The kind that makes a man very quiet at his daughter's school events and very careful about what he hopes for. "What do you want to do with these?" he said. "That's not my decision," Sylvain said. "I brought them to you. They belong to your story more than they belong to mine." He looked up at her then. You could see him deciding something. Not about whether to trust her. That was a longer calculation that would take weeks, maybe months. But deciding whether to stay in the room, whether to keep listening, whether he was still a person to whom something could be offered and not immediately taken back. "My daughter gets home at 4, he said. "I can be gone before 4. He nodded slowly. "Tell me what's in the file." She talked for almost an hour. He didn't interrupt much. Once, she said something about the regulatory filing, and he stopped her and asked her to go back, to explain what the Eastern Corridor notation meant in the context of the sign-off chain, and she did. Clearly, without condescension, which he noticed. He'd spent 4 years being talked to by people who explained things to him with a layer of patient simplification that told him exactly what they thought of him. Sylvain didn't do that. She talked to him like a person who'd worked a job and understood how jobs worked. At one point, she said, the review board findings were inconclusive because the documents that would have made them conclusive were never submitted. He sat with that for a moment. They had them, he said. It wasn't a question. Harwick's legal team had them. I don't know if they were technically required to disclose them given the nature of the review. I've asked my lawyer. The answer is complicated. Of course it is, he said. Yes, and Terravance. Terravance was acquired by Harwick 8 months before the incident. For the purposes of liability, they were not a separate entity in any meaningful way. She looked at him. I don't think your lawyer knew that. He didn't say anything. He stood up and went to the window that looked out over the backyard. There was a hockey net back there that Cleo had outgrown, but neither of them had taken down. The October light was flat and pale, the way Northern Ontario light gets in fall, like the sky has something on its mind. There's a woman, Nolan said, still looking out the window, who runs a legal aid clinic in Sudbury. She took on an environmental case 2 years ago up near Chapleau. She knows this territory. Sylvain was quiet for a moment. I've heard of that case. I'd want to talk to her before I do anything with those files. That's reasonable. He turned around. I'm not saying I trust you. I know. I'm saying I'm not throwing this away before I understand what it is. She nodded. That's all I'm asking. His name had been dragged through enough to make a man careful, and Nolan Berard was by temperament and by necessity a careful man. He didn't call the legal aid clinic that week. He thought about it. He went to work at the municipal yard, drove the Bobcat through the wet leaves the city trees had dropped, ate lunch in his truck listening to a radio station out of Timmins because the signal was reliable, and thought about a folder sitting on his kitchen table. He'd put it in the drawer under the microwave after Cleo got home. She'd asked who the car outside belonged to. He'd said an acquaintance, which was the most accurate word he could find. Cleo was 16, and she had her mother's way of not asking follow-up questions when she could tell a follow-up question would cost you something. He loved her for it. He also knew she filed things away, and that she'd ask eventually, and that he'd have to have something true to tell her. On the Thursday, he called the clinic. The woman who ran it was named Deirdre LaPointe Walsh. She had the voice of someone who'd spent 20 years on the phone with government offices. Not impatient exactly, but precise. He explained the situation in broad strokes. She asked 3 questions. The third one was about the acquisition date of Terravance. He told her what Sylvain had said. "Can you come in next week?" Deirdre said. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." The second time Sylvain came to the house, Cleo's was home. He hadn't planned it that way. Sylvain had called ahead. She'd asked if she could drop off a second file, something she'd found related to the ground survey reports from the year before the incident, and he'd said yes without thinking about the timing. Cleo was at the kitchen table doing homework when the knock came. He went to the door. Cleo didn't look up. When he came back in with Sylvain, and he could feel the strangeness of the word, bringing this woman into his house again. But it was factual, and the most honest word was usually the most useful one. Cleo looked up then. She looked at Sylvain. She looked at her father. She said, "Hi, this is Sylvain," Nolan said. "She's helping with something I'm working on." "Okay," Cleo said, and went back to her homework. But she was listening. He could tell from the way her pencil moved more slowly. Sylvain sat at the table again. She slid the second file across to him. She'd marked certain pages with small sticky tabs, not highlighted, not annotated, just flagged, letting him navigate it himself. He appreciated that more than he could easily say. They talked for 40 minutes. At one point, Cleo got up to get a glass of water, and on her way back she paused at the table and looked at the papers spread between them. "Is that a survey map?" she asked. "Yeah," Nolan said. "Of where?" "East of Gogama," he said, "near the Abitibi." Cleo looked at the map for a moment. She knew that name. She was 12 when it had happened, but she was the kind of 12-year-old who reads and remembers. "Okay," she said again and went back to her homework. When Sylvain left that evening, Cleo waited until the car had pulled away from the curb. Then she said, "Dad, yeah, is she helping you fix what happened?" He looked at his daughter. "I don't know yet," he said. "Maybe." Cleo nodded. She pulled her homework toward her. "Good," she said, in a tone that closed the subject in the way she always closed subjects she'd actually opened. Which was to say the subject wasn't closed at all, she was just setting it somewhere safe for later. Deirdre LaPointe Walsh looked at the folders for a long time without speaking. They were in her office above a dry goods store on Elm Street, which had the crowded, comfortable quality of a space that does real work. Stacked files, a whiteboard with case codes on it, a rubber plant that had survived more winters than some of her clients. She was in her 50s, small, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her forehead. She read for almost 20 minutes while Nolan sat across from her and waited. Then she put the papers down and looked at him. "The acquisition date changes things," she said. "If Terravance was a Harwick subsidiary at the time of the incident, then the liner order originated inside Harwick's corporate structure. Terravance didn't make that call independently, I know. Your review was conducted as though Terravance was an independent contractor, which means the scope of what they examined was," she searched for the word. "Incomplete," she said, which was the word a lawyer uses when they mean wrong. "There are grounds here for a formal challenge. Not a guarantee, but grounds." She looked at him over the folders. "Where did these come from?" He told her about Sylvain. Deirdre listened without expression. "Is she willing to speak to this?" Deirdre asked. She said she would. Her own liability in having kept these documents is something she'll need to navigate. But it doesn't make the documents inadmissible. Deirdre took her glasses off her forehead and set them on the desk. "Nolan, what do you want out of this? Tell me honestly," he thought about it. "I want my certification restored," he said. "I want it on record that the decision came from above me and that I opposed it. I don't need a payout. I don't need anyone to go to prison, though I'm not opposed to it." He paused. "I want to be able to tell Cleo what happened, clearly, without any part of it being a version that other people made up." Deirdre looked at him for a moment. "That's a clear brief," she said. "I've had 4 years to think about what I'd say if I ever got the chance. There is a particular kind of cruelty and institutional injustice that doesn't look like cruelty from the outside. It looks like process. It looks like findings and review periods and professional liability assessments and carefully worded conclusions that say nothing while meaning everything. It looks bureaucratic and tedious and impossible to be angry at in any clean way because there's no single person to face and no single moment to point to. It disperses itself across documentation and time, and the person it happens to ends up carrying something that has no clear shape, just weight. Nolan had been carrying that weight for 4 years. You want to know what it looks like day to day? It looks like driving a bobcat through wet leaves when you used to run a crew of 14. It looks like careful budgeting and silences you've learned to maintain, and a daughter who reads your face with a precision that breaks your heart a little, because she shouldn't have to. It looks like being competent at a smaller life than the one you built, and not being able to say that without sounding like complaint. So mostly you don't say it at all. Sylvain agreed to speak with Deirdre. They met at the clinic on a Friday afternoon. Nolan sat in on the meeting because it was his case, and Deirdre had asked him to be there, though he mostly listened. Sylvain was precise and prepared. She'd already spoken extensively with her own lawyer. She understood what she was doing, and she'd decided to do it anyway. At one point, Deirdre said, "Miss Cote-Whitfield, I want to ask you directly. What is your stake in this? What do you get from coming forward?" Sylvain was quiet for a moment. "I ran the northern division of a company that prioritized liability management over accountability for 4 years," she said. "And I was good at my job. I hit every target. I kept every project on schedule. And I told myself that the things I saw, the ways decisions got made, the way people got handled when they became inconvenient, I told myself those were normal, that this is how industries work." She looked at her hands briefly. "I don't think that's true. I think I just found it easier to not look too hard at what normal meant." She looked at Deirdre. "I'm not expecting this to make it right. I'm not even sure what right looks like from here. But I know what wrong looks like. I spent 4 years looking at it." The room was quiet. Nolan looked at the rubber plant by the window. The process was slow, the way these things always are. There were filings and counter-filings. Harwick Group retained a firm out of Bay Street whose name Nolan recognized from newspaper headlines about other cases, other quiet resolutions, other documents that materialized and were disputed and eventually could not be fully explained away. The certification board reopened the review in January. It took until March to schedule the first hearing. There were delays that felt tactical and some that probably were. Nolan went to work every day at the municipal yard. He drove the truck with the brake pads he'd finally replaced. He made Cleo's lunches and helped her with her university applications. She wanted to study environmental science, which he understood as her own way of pointing at the shape of things. And he went to Deirdre's office every few weeks to be updated on what was happening, and to sign things and to wait. Sylvain sent him a message in February, a short one, asking how he was doing. He answered honestly, which surprised him slightly. He said he was tired, but not the same kind of tired as before. She said she understood the difference. He thought she probably did. There was a moment, somewhere in late winter, when Deirdre called to tell him that Harwick's legal team had requested a conference rather than proceeding to the full hearing. Nolan stood in the parking lot of the municipal yard in a February wind that came off the Sudbury Basin like it was making a point. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means they think the documents are real and they'd prefer to negotiate than litigate," Deirdre said. And I told them we'd listen. That's different from agreeing to anything." She paused. "Your certification is a separate process from any settlement. I want to be clear about that. Getting one doesn't guarantee the other, but they're related. A negotiated acknowledgement that the decision was made at the Harwick level helps the certification board." He looked at the parking lot. Ice, and the kind of gravel that gets pressed into ice all winter. "What do you think I should do?" he said. "I think you should come in Thursday," she said. "And I think you should ask yourself what you said to me the first time we met, what you actually want from this." He knew what he wanted. He'd known for 4 years. The settlement meeting was in a boardroom in Sudbury that felt slightly too formal for the city, the kind of room that had been designed to assert something. Nolan sat on one side of the table with Deirdre. Harwick's representatives sat on the other side and chose their words with the visible care of people who have been advised not to say anything that constitutes an admission. They got most of what he'd asked for. Not all of it, that's not how these things work, but most. The company agreed to submit a formal statement to the certification board, indicating that the liner order had originated within Harwick's project management structure and had been issued without site foreman input. They agreed to a financial settlement that Nolan had asked Deirdre to keep modest, because the money wasn't the point. He didn't want it to look like the money was the point. They agreed to retract a reference from a former Terravance manager that had been quietly circulating in the industry for 4 years and making his name difficult. That last one he hadn't asked for. Deirdre had included it. He signed where he was told to sign. When they walked out of the boardroom and back into the ordinary winter air of Elm Street, Nolan stopped on the sidewalk for a moment. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to feel. Not triumph. He'd been too careful about hope to feel triumph, not relief exactly. Something more like the particular feeling of putting down something very heavy, when the body takes a moment to remember what it's like to stand without the weight. In April, the certification board issued its revised findings. They were unambiguous. He called Cleo at school. He hadn't told her the hearing was today. He'd learned from experience that telling her things like that in advance just gave her a day of quiet worry. And there'd been enough of that. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting anyway. "It's done," he said. A silence on the line. Then, "Done how?" "Done right," he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then he heard something that might have been a breath, or might have been the start of crying that she redirected because she was in school, and also because she was her father's daughter, and they both dealt with things sideways. "Okay," she said. "I'll see you at 4. "Yeah," he said, "I'll see you at 4. He called Sylvain that evening. She picked up after 2 rings. "The board issued revised findings," he said. "I heard," she said. "Deirdre sent me a note. I wanted to call. I'm glad you did." He stood in the kitchen while Cleo did homework at the table, the same light, and he tried to find words for something that didn't have easy words. What do you say to someone who carried the thing they didn't have to carry, back to the person it belonged to? There's no clean transaction there, no settling of accounts. You can't square it. You can only move forward from it, and try to do that with some honesty. "I don't know what I'd have done if you hadn't come," he said finally. "You'd have kept going," Sylvain said. "You were going to keep going regardless." "Maybe. But there's a difference between keeping going and knowing what you're keeping going toward." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "There is." He went back to work in the field that summer. Not Harwick, not Terravance, not any company that carried the association. A smaller outfit based in Timmins, running environmental assessment work for northern municipalities. The other side of the industry, in a sense. The side that asks questions rather than manages consequences. The foreman who interviewed him was a woman who'd worked the North for 30 years and who looked at his resume and said simply, "The Abitibi review." I followed that, and then moved on to questions about his crew management approach. He was hired on a Tuesday. The job started in May. The work was different and the same. There was still the particular satisfaction of understanding what a piece of ground is doing, of reading a site with the knowledge of someone who's been paying attention for a long time. The North, the particular vast and indifferent North, doesn't change its terms for anyone. It stays itself. He learned that again out on the rock in the spring air coming off the shield. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the thing he'd been kept from, returned to him by a combination of a woman with a leather bag and copies of documents she wasn't sure she was allowed to have, and a lawyer with a rubber plant and 20 years of precision, and his own daughter who'd asked, "Is she helping you fix what happened?" and filed the answer somewhere safe for later. He told Cleo the full story that summer, one evening on the back porch in sections over 2 hours. She listened the way she listened, entirely, without interrupting, asking one question at the end. "Were you scared?" she said. "When you started, that it wouldn't work?" "Yeah," he said. "I was scared the whole time." She thought about that. "But you kept going," she said. "Yeah, good," she said. The hockey net was still in the yard. Neither of them had taken it down. The summer light sat on it and on the porch and on the back of his hands resting on the railing. And Cleo was beside him. And somewhere to the north the shield spread out for hundreds of kilometers. Patient and enormous and entirely unconcerned with the small dramas of human accountability. But the dramas were real and they mattered. And the light that evening was the particular gold of a northern summer that makes everything look briefly like it is exactly where it's supposed to be.